Great, I can't do anything. It's my computer just froze. Okay, here we go.
Entrepreneurial, leadership, intellectual, this is the Cultural Connections Podcast.
And good evening, everybody. My name is Brian Ives, and I am the producer and the host of the Cultural Connections Podcast. Before I get started today, I want to remind all of our viewers at home that we are recording this episode live on Monday, October 28th, 2024. And we are recording this episode live streamed to YouTube. So therefore, if you have a question for our guests this evening, please feel free to comment below, and we will do our best to get you your questions answered. Tonight's episode of the podcast is a continuation on our little mini-series that we began last week on the 5 ballot questions here in Massachusetts. So far on this, in this little mini-series that we've done, we have focused in on both sides of question 4, which we recorded last week, alongside with the yes side to this particular question, question 5. Tonight on the podcast, we are focusing yet again on question 5 on the podcast, but why you should be voting no this time around on the podcast. Today on the podcast, we have 2 guests joining us today that are very big proponents against why to vote no on the podcast, and both of they are Doug Bacon. Doug is the owner of 8 restaurants and bars in the Boston area, and is a very very big supporter of voting no on this particular question. In addition to that, we have Yvonne Byliss, who is also joining us today. She comes with 20 years of experience in the restaurant business, in both the front and back of the house of restaurants. And recently, she returned back to working in the restaurant sector to help pay for her daughter's college tuition. So thank you both so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Happy to be with you.
Thank you. I'm going to start off with the both of you introducing yourself. We'll start with you. I'll start with you, Doug, to begin with, to giving us a little bit more of a background than what I just gave, and a little bit more about yourself to tell our viewers.
Sure. I was a bartender and a server for more than 10 years. In 1990, I scraped together money, some of which I earned working for tips, and some that I borrowed from family and friends, to open a neighborhood bar in Brighton, which is called The Last Drop, and it's still there. That was in 1990. I grew the business, and I added locations along the way over the last 34 years. And now I am the owner and operator and manager of 8 locations, all in Boston, all neighborhood bars and restaurants, all affordable places where people go to meet their friends, to catch dinner on the way home, or to stop for a drink on the way out. And I am staunchly against question 5, and I'm happy to talk about why.
All right. Thank you so much. And I'll let you do the same, Yvonne.
Yes. So I also started in the restaurant business in the 90s. I emigrated here from Ireland. And I came here, and my college degree, unfortunately, I had to go back to school in order to comply with Massachusetts. So I started as a server. I started with Paparazzi's, the Back Bay Restaurant Group, which Charlie Saucus, he owned 34 restaurants. And I put myself through college, but during that time, I loved, everything about the restaurant business. So I went from, server to restaurant manager to GM. And then after I had my daughter, I left and pursued my career. But I've always loved the restaurant business. I always loved being there. I love the excitement. You never know what's going to happen. Being under pressure, and it's just fun. You meet people from all walks of life. You get to know your guests, you get to, experience, their kids growing up and so forth. And then maybe even coming and joining the restaurant business as a server. So I went back about 5 years ago, which is always great as a server because once you know the industry, you can always fall back on it. And that's what I did to put my daughter through college. And, now I work from home. So for me, it's a great social aspect to go over to the restaurant. It gives me that office feeling of comrade and that you don't have like working from home. So I love it now, and I go 2, 3 nights a week, and the social part of it is what I love most about it.
Absolutely, I can totally understand that. It is definitely a fun experience going out to a restaurant. Before I go further, I did just totally realize I neglected to explain what question five is to our viewers. So those that are at home wondering what is question five, here is the proposed ballot question that is going to be on the ballot next Tuesday, November 3rd. November 3rd. The question states as follows: that the proposed law would gradually increase the minimum hourly wage. An employer must pay a tipped worker. This specifically then goes into over the course of a 5-year schedule on the following schedule, starting at 64% of the state minimum wage on January 1st, 2025, to 73% of the state minimum wage on January 1st, 2026, to 82% of the state minimum wage on January 1st, 2027, to 91% of the state minimum wage on January 1st, 2028, and lastly to 100% of the state minimum wage on January 1st, 2029. Now, my question to either one of you here is specifically in relation to this ballot question. And I've been asking this question similarly along to all 5 of these ballot questions for the episodes that I've done so far on related to these topics. Is what give us the information more detailed about this ballot measure and the implications it would have on Massachusetts if somehow it was to pass. I'll let you start, Yvonne.
Okay. So first of all, I think the way the question itself is written, especially the yes part, it's very misleading. It almost feels like it's misinformation. So, the question, it says that you would get paid $15 an hour. But what they're not saying is that we already are earning $15 an hour. The law in Massachusetts is if you don't meet the $15 hourly with what we're paid hourly, minimum wage, and then your tips, the restaurant has to bring that up to $15 an hour. So we are already getting $15 an hour. So that's not going to change. What will change is our tips. The studies show that, when minimum wage raises, that tips decrease. And most restaurant servers, bartenders like myself, we're working over there for a second job. We're working hard and we get paid more than $15 an hour. We live in Massachusetts, which is the second most expensive state. And working at the restaurant business helps to supplement my daytime job, the wage. So now that's going to be taken away from me. So instead of making, $25, $30 an hour, I'm going to be just making $15 an hour. And, it's just, it wouldn't be worth it for a lot of servers and bartenders.
Absolutely, I can understand what you're saying here. Let me ask you, Doug, as the owner of several restaurants in the Boston area, from your side with this question, what would be, I mean, how would this greatly impact the business side of your business, your several of your restaurants? How would this impact you?
Question 5 would be very bad for small business owners. Restaurants employ people who like to deliver good service and good hospitality. And in return, the consumers know that they are expected to tip. Although they're not obligated or required or compelled to tip, most people do tip generously when they get good service and good hospitality. So for small business owners, the increase in labor costs would force all full service restaurants to raise menu prices. And we all know what happens when things get more expensive. Consumers look for alternatives and they will buy less in full service restaurants. We know that business will go down, some restaurants will close, and full service restaurant opportunities will diminish for consumers. For small business owners, it will dramatically reduce their businesses. Menu prices will go up, which will be bad for consumers, and jobs will be lost, and tips will be lost for servers and bartenders. This question was entirely 100% funded by an out-of-state group from California, and they seem to think that business owners will just raise their prices and servers and bartenders will still get the same tips, and now they'll make more money. And that just will not happen. It's a simple law of economics that when you raise the price of things, consumers find alternatives and they will go out less often. We will be left with fast food, which will be entirely unaffected by this proposal, and maybe fine dining at the high end, where consumers are going out for a special event or a birthday or an anniversary, and they're expecting to pay a high price. They will pay an even higher price. But affordable restaurants will be challenged and many will just close. This is a very bad thing, and everyone should vote no on question 5.
Thank you. I appreciate that. My next question then to either one of you here then is as to my understanding from research that I've done and other information that I have heard is that there are a few other states in the country, I believe, those are being out in the West Coast specifically, if I recall correctly, that have passed legislation that is similar to what's being asked here. What do you agree? Do you think that those states did the wrong thing in passing that legislation? And what is the difference then between for people that are trying to understand, well, what if these states have it, what's the difference? What is the difference between the legislation that these other states that passed it that is not here in Massachusetts in this particular legislation?
So, first of all, no state has changed their laws in more than 25 years. California has not had a tip credit and did not have a tip credit for more than 40 years. The economy in California is very different, and there are many fewer full-service affordable restaurants in California than there are in Massachusetts. Small business owners in California offer much less in the way of service. In many cases, in a small restaurant, you go up to a counter and order your food and take a number, and then it's delivered to your table. There are fewer jobs in restaurants. I have had employees who have moved to California, and within 2 years, they came back because they said it's very difficult to make a living. Consumers tip less in California. Some of my workers have told me that they only expected to get around 10% when they were working in California, although they did earn the full minimum wage. So they did earn a slightly higher rate on their hourly pay. The tips were so much dramatically less, it became very difficult to make a living wage.
I think for me, as a tipped employee, that when we do look at California and we look at Toast, so Toast is kind of the restaurant micros computer. So they did actually a survey, and California has the lowest tip average among the 50 states. Among 50 states, the lowest tip average. And then you look at what's happening in DC. DC passed the ballot measure I-86 in 2022. It's an absolute disaster. The fair wage, they say, oh, it was a success, but it wasn't. Because when you look at it, 10% of servers and bartenders have lost their jobs. The DC Council has had to go in and try and protect restaurants and servers. The AG's office has had to go in. It's an absolute disaster, the rollout. The Washingtonian did a great article in March of 2024, and just they interviewed servers, bartenders, restaurant owners, and no one had anything positive to say. It was, and it's still a disaster. There is server charges. Tipped employees are going home. They don't know what their tips were. They don't know what their hourly tip is of what they earned. And that's to me is unacceptable for any business, not just a restaurant business, that you don't know what your hourly is when you're leaving after working.
Absolutely. I fully understand and agree with what you're saying. Then I guess my next question to either, well, actually, before I go further on that, I do want to remind all of our viewers here at home that are watching. This is the Cultural Connections podcast. We are live on Monday, October 25th, 2024. And we are we are talking today about the 5 ballot questions of Massachusetts that are on the ballot next Tuesday, November 3rd. This particular question that we're talking about is question 5, which is the proposed law that would gradually increase the minimum hourly wage that an employer must pay a tipped worker. Now mine, and if you have a question you'd like us to answer on the podcast, please feel free to comment below during here on YouTube, and we will gladly do our best to answer them here live. My next question then to you then here is, why do, if either one of you answer, why do you think now that this was brought to the ballot? What made this all of a sudden decide that, okay, now is the time that this should be brought up? Why is this now being brought up and it not 4 years later or 4 years before? Why now? Was any ideas to that?
You would have to ask the activist from California. I know
Hmm.
you had Grace McGovern on.
Yes.
She would be the one to answer that question. I know she's a Massachusetts resident,
Yeah.
but the group that financed this is entirely 100% a California group that poured $900,000 into Massachusetts to fund their ill-conceived plan from California for Massachusetts. It's a terrible thing. It's a bad thing. I hope all of your voters will, all of your listeners and your viewers will vote no on 5.
Absolutely. Then I continue then here in the question here as we look. I mean, at the restaurant business, which obviously itself suffered greatly during the COVID pandemic. That was a big, obviously, impact to the restaurant business, as we know. With something like this, moving forward, what 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 I guess is the question that comes to mind here is, how do voters understand this question better than the way? Because I feel like I think a lot of people are like myself, even I would say, look at this ballot question simply just by reading what they can get in their Massachusetts Voters Guide, and they see a basic question there that may not make a lot of sense to them. How do you make sense out of a question that just doesn't make sense?
I
So
think
don't
sorry, go ahead.
go
I
ahead,
think
Yvonne.
talking to your servers,
Yeah.
talking to that favorite bartender when you go in and have a drink, going to your favorite restaurant and asking the people that it's going to affect, and this is who it's going to affect. But remember, it's going to affect everyone because you as a diner, you as a guest to this restaurant, it's going to affect you for higher prices, you
Right.
know, and so it will eventually affect everybody. And then when we look at like the restaurants, like the restaurant that I work, it's a small community restaurant. It's been there for 35 years. It's literally nestled in our community, and it's such a big part of our community.
Mm,
From hosting events, helping out the residents. I mean, I remember, and in return, I remember when COVID did happen and we went outdoors. A lot of the neighbors came with their patio furniture to try and help us because they want us there,
right.
So go and ask your local restaurant, go in there and just ask us. We're willing to tell you why, and we know why.
Yeah.
So
Okay. Go
from
ahead.
my perspective, Brian, if I may,
Yes.
uh, the the simple thing for your listeners and your viewers to know, as Yvonne said, was ask your local restaurant owner, ask your server, ask your bartender. They understand this business because they work in it. But
Mm,
but don't take my word for it. The governor, Maura Healey of Massachusetts, came out with a very strong statement in favor of voting no on this. And one of the things she explained was she had been a server for a long time. She was the attorney general in charge of enforcing our laws, and now she's the governor. And she understands that this is the wrong change for Massachusetts at this time. It's
mm.
not needed. It would be devastating to small businesses and to tipped workers. It's very important. Don't take my word for it. Maura Healey is against it and suggests that everyone should vote no on question 5.
Absolutely. I totally understand what you're saying. My next question, and this is specifically a viewer question that we have that just came in specifically here for Yvonne. And that question is what to ask what your customers say when they ask her position on question 5, which is what what this particular viewer says. So many people think they are denying the server a pay raise. What is your
Yes. So when I explain, that we already do make $15 an hour, they're like, "Oh, but it doesn't seem that way because they're saying you're going to get a pay increase making $15 an hour." And I say, no, no. The Fair Labor Standard Act requires that I do make $15 an hour, and I make more than $15 an hour. And if you take away my tips, then I will only make $15 an hour, and it's not worth it, I mean, as I said, Massachusetts is the second most expensive state, and $15 an hour, people are not going to make ends meet. They're not going to be able to afford rent. They're not going to be able to afford to go out for dinner,
Mhm. Right.
So, yeah. But once I explain that and why I'm against it, all my guests are like, I'm voting no.
Right. Absolutely. No, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Uh,
Thank you, Yvonne. You're a good advocate.
um, my next question and comes along the lines here. Then, um, is that that in the restaurant business as a whole, I mean, and I think there's some misconception on this that for people when they think of restaurants, they think of a lot of the big chain restaurants, that this like won't maybe negatively have a big impact on the chain restaurants, but what is understood that this would have an impact on the smaller restaurants, and that was something I brought up on the yes side when I had them on the other day. My question to you is how how do you move forward with this, and like what is the next step after, if let's say this does not pass? Is there I mean, how do we what's the next step in moving forward after this ballot question, in the assumption it doesn't pass, and working with restaurants to make sure that things continue in the direction where we are probably right now before this ballot question?
So what will happen is if Massachusetts voters vote no on this question, there will be no change except restaurant owners will continue operating in a very difficult environment. Since COVID, restaurants have been in a very challenging working environment. The cost of everything has gone up: insurance, utilities, food costs, rent. The cost of hiring and employing people has gone up. It's an extremely challenging environment, but voting no means restaurateurs will be able to survive. If yes vote happens, it will lead to big changes, and many will be undesired by voters, meaning restaurants will close, wages and total compensation will go down for servers and bartenders, and menu prices will go up.
Absolutely. No, I totally understand what you're saying. Um, then let's talk. I mean, because I think in general, one thing I think people are thinking about, especially in the political culture right now, with everything going on, and the big thing we hear, obviously, about, and this I think probably pertains more to a grocery store than it does to a restaurant, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, is inflation and the whole issue now in inflation in this country, and how that plays a role into a customer thinking about the restaurant business. How if you think about inflation, does inflation have any factor at all into this?
Yes, absolutely. If question 5 passes, menu prices will go up dramatically.
Mm.
But I
It-
mean, I think inflation has already played a role in the restaurant
Mhm.
business, I mean, definitely profits are leaner than what they were, because food costs have gone up, just like the grocery. When you go to the grocery store and instead of an avocado being $2, now it's $3, that cost is still for the restaurant. It's the same. The cost of food has gone up. The cost of, gas has gone up. So that means the cost of large contributors like Cisco and that are driving the goods, that has raised. So profits are definitely leaner than what they were before COVID. I mean, and Doug can attest to this. I don't think profits have gone back to what they were pre-COVID.
No, absolutely not. It's an
Mm.
extremely challenging business environment.
Absolutely. I definitely hear what you're saying on that. As we believe it or not, I'm going to say one more time that if you are just tuning in, this is the Cultural Connections podcast. We are live here on Monday, October 28th, 2024, talking about one of the 5 ballot questions here that's going to be on the November ballot next Tuesday, a week from tomorrow, November 3rd. This is particularly question 5, which states why with the proposed law, which states that the proposed law would gradually increase the minimum wage an employer must pay a tipped worker. And we are joined today by 2 guests today. First is Doug Bacon, owner of 8 restaurants and bars in the Boston area, as well as Yvonne Byliss, who has 20 years of experience on the restaurant business and is currently working part for a local restaurant as well at this time. Within the last few minutes that we have, because we're already, believe it or not, running up to our time. I always say it's amazing to me on how time runs by so quickly on these podcasts. I guess actually, we'll do it this way. I think this is the better way because this will give you guys a few minutes here for each of you again to recap the importance as to why it is so important for viewers to understand from your point of view to voting no on this particular question. I'll let you start, Doug.
Thank you again for the opportunity, Brian. I would strongly encourage all of your viewers and listeners to vote no on question 5, and here's why. This is a solution in search of a problem. None of the servers or bartenders in Massachusetts are asking for a change to the way the compensation works in hospitality in Massachusetts. Servers and bartenders, for the most part, are very well compensated when you include their tips. They do not want to see a change to this system. Jobs will be lost, tips will go down. Small businesses will likely close, many of them. Large chain restaurants will be much better suited to adapt and adjust. Small independent restaurants will be extremely challenged. Small restaurants that offer full service in every city and town in Massachusetts on main streets and in every shopping district may disappear. We might be left with only fast food and fine dining. Menu prices for consumers will go up dramatically. It's a lose-lose-lose situation for question 5. Please vote no on question 5. Thank you again for this opportunity, Brian.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I'll let you, Yvonne, have
Yes.
chance as well.
So I ask all Massachusetts voters to please support the Massachusetts servers and bartenders and restaurant workers and join us and vote no on November 5th. The reason being because it will put a lot of us out of work. Restaurants will close and we will lose our jobs. We have not asked for this at all. We did not ask for this question to be on the ballot. Question 5 to be on the ballot. 90% of servers, bartenders, restaurant workers oppose this. So please join us and vote no. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And I am going to jump to one more factor because we just got one more viewer question. But at the very last minute, usually we never get these many viewer questions, but obviously you can tell this is a very hot topic. So I want to ask about the fact that this viewer is particularly saying that there's a paragraph in the bill that allows for sharing their tips. Can one of you explain what exactly that means and what they're trying to get at in that?
Sure. By Massachusetts law, if you give a tip to a server in a restaurant, that tip cannot be shared with anyone who has no interaction with the guest. And what that means is the tips can be pooled amongst the bartender and the server and the bus person and the food runner, but not anyone else. The cooks and the dishwashers and the bookkeepers and the people who cut the grass in front of the restaurant and the people who clean the restaurant cannot share in the tips. Only the workers who are working in that restaurant on that shift can participate in the tips. If this law passes, it would change that and would allow tip sharing, which would be 100% controlled by the owners of the restaurant. And I'm an owner, but I don't want to do this. The owner could decide from now on, all the tips are going to be pooled and we're going to share the tips with the cooks and the dishwasher and the cleaning people, and maybe even the bookkeeper in the office. So for me, as a consumer, when I get great service and great hospitality and someone hustles and they talk to me about the specials and they smile, I want to tip generously and know with confidence that my tip that I leave for that server is only going to be shared with the server and a couple of the support people in the restaurant.
Absolutely. Thank you for answering that last minute question. As we start to wrap up here, I just want to my one last thing here that I wanted to just ask is that if people want to learn more about this ballot question and understand more about it and read more detail on it, is there any website they can go online, or is there any more information online that they can find about this and why to vote no on this particular question?
Protecttips.org.
Okay, perfect. We will
And
have
ask your server and your bartender from your local restaurant, please.
absolutely.
We can answer all your directions eye to eye.
Absolutely. I 100%.
Thank you, Yvonne.
Thank you both again so much for joining me today here on the podcast. Again, I want to just reiterate that the Cultural Connections podcast is not endorsing either side of these two questions. We are specifically here to educate you on these ballot questions, to give you the informative information so you can make an informative decision. As a reminder, the polls will be open in Massachusetts starting on next Tuesday, November 3rd.
It's November 5th.
November 5th. It's sometime in November. Keep losing track. Thank you for the correction. November 5th. I'm looking and I'm writing. I can't read my own handwriting here. November 5th. And polls will be open if you haven't voted already, or early voting is already available. And tomorrow, by the way, if you wanted to vote by mail, is the final date to register to vote by mail. You will need to get your registration to vote by mail in the mail, or registered by the end of the day tomorrow. So do keep that in mind if you plan to vote by mail. That said, again, thank you to both Doug and
Thank you, Brian.
Yvonne, for joining me today. Thank you. And if you have questions, comments, or would like to submit ideas for future episodes of the podcast, please feel free to email me directly at brianives@gmail.com. That's BRIANIV as in Victor, ES@gmail.com. And we will obviously take your ideas into consideration. And we will be continuing this series. Stay tuned with us on Wednesday afternoon, roughly at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We will be taking on question 2, and specifically why you should be with the no side of question 2. We'll be talking about that ballot question next. And we, again, if you tune in around then, we always take live questions like we did today. So feel free to comment live, and we'll, of course, answer them for you during the live broadcast. For now, I'm Brian Ives, and I am the producer and the host of the Cultural Connections podcast. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hold on.
Thank you again for watching this episode of the Cultural Connections podcast. For more information on today's episode, be sure to check out our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also watch this episode again in its entirety on our YouTube channel. This podcast is also available on listening platforms Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Breaker, Radio Public, and New TV. Thanks again for watching this episode of the Cultural Connections podcast.